Hello, Bucharest. Hello. My name is Ruth. I think Bruce covered that bit. Everybody does these intros about themselves, so I thought it was about time I did a talk where I actually did that. I'm a creative developer. I have a podcast. Now, I get to put this in this talk for the first time because we released it yesterday. It's completely irrelevant to this talk. It is about creative development and generative art, but if you are interested in that, you can find it on generativeartistry.com. I do it with an incredible co-host, Tim Holman, because if I don't mention that, he's going to be unhappy with me. But he is amazing, and we did release it yesterday, and I just wanted to mention that. So I have a podcast. Some other stuff that I do, I actually teach as well. I teach adults how to code. So I thought that what we could do together, and it was very, very interesting seeing the hands go up about who knows about this subject, because it was no one. Was I thought it'd be really, really nice, instead of doing a talk, is if we could do a nice little class together about CSS Houdini. So today we're going to have a lesson. Back in the spring, I helped MDN Docs write some demos for CSS Houdini. So what I wanted to do today was just share with you the things that I learnt whilst I was doing it. Because it is all relatively new. I went on a massive learning curve whilst I was doing it. And I'm here to share that information. What is Houdini? It's a very ambiguous term, and actually, it's just a word that someone made up. It doesn't actually really mean anything, and it was just a buzzword to encompass a whole bunch of APIs that come into a suite that allow us to extend the functionality of CSS. That's it. It's not one thing. I talk to a lot of people that be like, hey, I know CSS Houdini, it's this one API. It's not, it's a lot of them. And it's probably not going to stop at the ones that I introduced today. There's probably going to be more. So it is just a word that we use, and it's stuck. And so when we describe it, we just say, yeah, CSS Houdini. But there's lots and lots of parts to it. So I'm just going to go over them. But suffice to say, it's all about extending functionality of CSS. When we get a new CSS feature, when we hear about something that's coming into spec, Grid came in a couple of years ago, as developers, as front-end developers, we sort of go through this mindset of, that's great, but we know that it needs to go into spec. People need to talk about it. It then needs to be drafted and put through W3C stuff that goes on. Browsers then have to implement it. That happens at different rates. There's probably going to be some bugs that you have to watch out for. For us as developers, that's quite an annoying process because we want to use these new features, but we're sort of, we've got to push this to production. So that's not something that we can do immediately. The idea behind this is that we're able to polyfill those features easily and better. Because when we use polyfills now, we tend to have a JavaScript polyfill to do something for CSS. And what that tends to do is it tends to look at a CSS file, read through all of it, try and find the bit of new feature that you're doing, pass some strings in, like shuffle some stuff in there to override the stuff that you have written. It's not particularly performant. It's using strings where, it's just not nice, right? And these are things that we have to watch out for. We probably haven't written the polyfill. We don't have a lot of control over it. It might be buggy. It's not a great process. And we want to use these new CSS features. They are nice and they're great, and we do. So the idea behind this is it's not a shiny CSS thing. I want to say this strongly. Like, we have this cool stuff that we can use, but it's not something that we're going to go ahead and polyfill. This is so that we have more control over CSS. But we do it through JavaScript. That's the other thing. A lot of people sort of talk about JavaScript, CSS in JavaScript. Isn't JavaScript in CSS? We're front-end developers. We code HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. All these arguments are mute. So let's look at the APIs that are underneath this Houdini buzzword. We've got typed OM, CSS Paint API, properties and values, layout API, and the animation worklet. Now, I am going to talk mostly about typed.om, CSS Paint, and properties and values. I'm going to go over layout API and animation worklet just a tiny bit. I'm going to touch on them. And the reason for that is this. Now, hopefully yes. This is Houdini ready yet? This was built by Surma at Google, who apparently is getting a lot of shout-outs today. And this shows you the state of these APIs in the browsers as it stands. My apologies, because typed.om is slightly cut off there. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Let's do that. There we go. So everything in red, don't worry about it. It's not there yet. What we've got is we've got the APIs down the left and the browsers across the top. We can sort of ignore Microsoft Edge in the middle there because that will probably equal the first column in the near future. There's a couple here, like the parse API I'm not talking about at all because no signal. I can omit it. We don't have much time. But as you can see, typed.om at the bottom there and Paint API second down, they're the most colorful. So red is nothing. Orange and purple are sort of coming in development. And yellow and green are, we've got it. Some features we need, that kind of stuff, right? So the colors are there. This is something that is coming. Some are more implemented than others. I am not saying use this. I'm saying use your discretion. I'm saying start learning it, look into it, okay? The time is now, and that's fine. It might be a couple of years before more of this is green, and that's okay. This is part of being a front-end developer, right? But this is why I'm going to go into Paint API, typed.om, and properties and values, because they are the most colorful on this chart. And they're the ones that we've been doing for MDN as well. So, okay, yeah, keyboard shortcuts are working, cool. Typed.om. This is actually my favorite. Access to CSS values as types in JavaScript, right? Let me sum this up. I just want to go over some words that I am going to be using, just so we're all on the same page. I'm sure we've heard all of this before, but this is a lesson. This is some CSS that I've written for this button, right? Button border width 4 pixels. The button is the selector. We have lots of different ways of writing selectors in CSS. I could put a class in there. I could put an ID. We've got complex selectors. That's my selector. That's my element which the CSS is affecting. Border width, that's my property. There's lots of properties. Last time I checked a couple of years ago, there were 438, so I'm going to go there's 450. I don't know all of them. But that's the thing that we're going to change on the element. That's my property. This 4 pixels here, that's the value, right? There's even more of those. And all the values are obviously related to the properties that we want to set. In the way that we change these values outside of CSS as it stands at the moment is a little bit like this. For me to get it, say, in my JavaScript, I use the .style notation. I'm sure we've all seen this. I'm sure we've all used it. And if I get it, so button element, I just grabbed this from the DOM, query selector button. .styles.border width gives me back a string. OK, that's fine. But if I want to reset that because of anything else that's happening in my application, I have to work with that string. And that could be any unit of measure. So it does make it quite tricky. It can be also any amount. It's not a great way of working. And setting it back on the element as well, buttonl.style.borderWidth equals, I've got to then revert it back to a string, especially if I've converted it to a number to change the value. It's pretty icky, right? Wouldn't it be great is when I got that value out of my CSS, that I actually got a number and a unit instead of a string? That, my class, is typed.om. Oh, yes. And it's pretty cool. So the idea behind it is that every single value type that we have in CSS will come back as an object with that information. So in this case, we're actually returning a unit value type. And we use this computed style map method. Now, this gets us back all the CSS which is affecting our element. So I want to use the get method on this and pass in I'm looking at my slides. Border, top, width. This is directly related to the CSS property. We don't have to do any of that camel casing anymore. Like, this is as the CSS property is written in CSS. And that gets me back an object with the value, which is 4, and the unit, which is pixels. And this will work with any of your values that are units in CSS. Now, this is much cleaner, much nicer way of working in my JavaScript now. There's lots of these different types of values in CSS. As it stands in TypedOM version 1 at the moment, everything is a CSS star value. So if something hasn't been spec'd out as an actual value type, it will come back as a CSS star value. Everything is under that hood. We have a CSS keyword value. So in your CSS, if you've written like a string that's not in quotes, so auto, float left, display block, anything like that, that's a keyword value. That's the type that you'll get returned if you call it. CSS numeric value, that's the parent type for the unit value which you just saw. And underneath that sits the unit value. So these are your EMs, your pixels, your millimeters, like all of those sort of lengths and units that you have. But also we have CSS math sum. So when you're using calc functions in CSS, or min or max, which we now have, that comes back as the actual sum that you are doing and the unit values that you're doing within that CSS. CSS transform value has been spec'd, which is really nice. You know, when you do like transform, rotate 80 degrees, but also you've got scale 1.2. And in your JavaScript, you want to rotate it some more, but you don't want to change the scale, but you kind of got to keep it all in a string, and that's kind of annoying. CSS transform value solves that problem, because each one of those types, rotate, scale, translate, are all different value types in TypedOM. So you're just working with these objects, and it's nicer, and it's cleaner, and it's just, thank you. There's CSS unparsed value and CSS variable reference value, and they're talking about CSS variables and how we get them and how we pass them back. TypedOM version 2 is being spec'd, well, talked about, implemented as you speak, and this contains things like images, colors, and all that other stuff which is not here. This is how we get one of these values. CSS is what we just saw. But how do we set it and how do we create these value types? Here's 2 ways of creating that unit value type, which I just got from the button. We can use the class method, so we can do new CSS unit value, and we pass in the amount and the unit. An easier way is this factory method. So just do css.pixel10, and that creates one of these CSS unit value types. That's quite nice. Now, when we work with .style in JavaScript, we are setting things on the style attribute. We haven't really changed that too much when we want to set styles on elements, but we can start working with the attribute style map instead. So we can actually pass these types into the attribute style map. So I can use attribute style map on the bottom element .set, give it the CSS property, give it the value type that I have created here. That's going to set a different border on my button. But also I have a few other methods on this style attribute, which were kind of annoying before when I was just working with .style. You can retrieve any styles that are on the style element with the get method. You can see whether the style attribute has a CSS property very easily, just by using the has method and just passing in the property from CSS. You can delete it, so you can just delete one of the styles. You don't have to look at everything that's on there and find the right one, and yeah. And you can clear everything off the style attribute of an element as well. All of these just make it just nicer, right? We just have a little bit more power. A couple of other, it's quite a big thing TypedOM. We've got more things. The numeric value type, what number are we on? Yeah. This comes with a few methods just out of the box. We can do things like add, subtract, where's my mouse? Yeah. Add, subtract, multiply with these types that we've created, find the min and max, just because we're working with these types. Math sum, just to cover that. This is, like I said, when you use calc in CSS, we get back the calculation that we're doing and the units. Yes. A little bit like this. So it's a math sum type, so we can create one with new math sum type. We pass in those two values that we get, or that we want to create, and it's still CSS unit values that we're working with, but we also get the operator, whether that's multiplication or division or a sum. Okay. Transforms. This is one of my favorites, and I've actually used this because I do a lot of transformations, and I will string these all together, and I want to change all of them. And having to put them back together after I've changed them is very, very annoying. So for me, what are we on? 4, 5, 5. This is really, really good. So you take something like this, for instance, and we do have to be like, oh, I want to change the rotate, but then I've got to remember to put the scale back on because that's different, slightly annoying. What we can do now is just create those types. We have a CSS transform value, which creates the whole value, but we have a CSS rotate value and a CSS scale, and all the ones that you can get within a transform. So we're creating each one individually, and we can change one individually, and there are all these unit values, so we can still work with numbers, and we don't have to be working with strings. And it sort of goes on, and you've got is2d flags, and you can do matrices. Yes, look at that. You know, for anyone that excites as much as me, and no one's smiling, I'm like, this looks so cool. It may seem a little bit strange to start, right? If you just want to change like one thing, you've got .style, and it is quite easy, and we remember it, and this seems like a lot to learn at this point. We've also got things like class list, and we've got toggles now, and that keeps everything in CSS, and that's quite nice. But we do have to be careful of performance. So typed-om is probably worth looking into. The other real thing about typed-om is it does underpin all the other APIs because they are using these typed values. This is really easily seen with the Properties and Values API. We've all seen CSS variables, probably by now. The dash notation as values in our CSS, and we've used them. I am going to be referring to them as custom properties from now on, right? Because I always have, and if I start saying CSS variables, I'll say custom properties, and I'll start using different language. So I'm going to start saying custom properties. I'm actually using them for the button styling that you just saw in the previous example. So I'm setting a main color custom property for the background. So I'm setting it to be blue in the previous section of this talk, and then the background color is, I'm just referring to that custom property. And we have had in JavaScript for ages now, and we've probably all used this, right? Updating our custom properties in real time? Yeah, sure. We do this. I do this. If we do .star set property and we reference that custom property, we can reset its value. And we can do this in real time as well. So we can be updating our CSS in our JavaScript in real time. So that's what I've done for this section of the talk. And for the keen-eyed among you, you would have noticed I'm doing it for the background as well. So I've got this main color in the talk, and I'm just resetting it for the sections using JavaScript like this, right? So I'm just, so for the first section, I wanted it to be purple. For the second section, I'm having it to be blue. For this section, I'm going to set it to be pink. And I'm just doing that with this one custom property that I have. It is a little bit more complicated than that. This background image that I've got for the button is a linear gradient. It's not one flat color. So I've actually got the main color at the top, and I've got a lighter color at the bottom. This isn't properties and values quite yet, by the way. But this can be quite annoying because that means that I have to set the main color, so I've got purple and blue and pink. Then I've got to work out a lighter color, and then I've got to set lighter main blue and lighter main pink, and you've just got like this whole set of colors, right, in your CSS. And I'm not using a preprocessor, so I don't have any lighter or darker functionality or functions that I can use, any color functions. So maybe we could use Houdini to polyfill that. Okay. So let's get this main color. And I can do that. So I'm using reveal for the slide. So my outer has got this main color set on it, so I can reset it for all the different sections. I'm going to grab it. I'm then going to change that color to make a lighter color. So rather than set all my lighter colors in my CSS to start with, I'm going to get the main color and just make it lighter, right? This color from HSLA function I have written and is separate. I don't want to confuse the code. And what that is doing is it's taking this HSLA value, which I set as main color, it's splitting it up into hue, saturation, lightness, and opacity, and returning them as numbers. Now, when we do get color types in typed OM, that's going to be a moot point, and it's going to be great. But for the moment, my split cull.luminosity, that one there, is just a number of the luminosity value of my main color. So all I need to do is add 10 to it, make it lighter, and I've got a lighter color, right? That's my lighter color function polyfill. I could go on. I could make a whole color palette object out of this. But for the purposes of this is my lighter color. Now I can use properties and values to create a custom property to put back in my CSS, because that's this API. So I do CSS register property. This is properties and values. I've got lighter main, so this is my lighter color. And this whole thing is now accessible via my CSS. So I can now use it in my gradient function for my background for my button. What we've got here is we set a name. Don't forget your 2 first dashes. This is still a custom property in CSS, so your CSS still wants those 2 dashes. But you can call this whatever you want. This is your name. Syntax. This is relevant to the types that we just saw in typed OM. Although we don't have color yet, we are going to get color. So I've allowed myself to use it here. All that's going to happen is that's going to be passed up to be a CSS star value by default. But you can use length, transform, all those things that we just saw, and that's going to be the type of value that we have. We don't have this as custom properties when we set them in CSS at the moment. We have no way of saying it's this type. We're just literally setting dash dash something and then this ambiguous term. And this is really useful because now we can test for it, and the CSS won't pass unless it's this type. Also very useful. Whether it inherits, so this is false by default. I want it to inherit down my DOM tree, which is essentially what I'm saying here, because I'm using it for both the background and the button. So I want all my DOM elements to be able to access it. You can set it to false if you just want it on one. And then the initial value. So you can set an initial value on this. You can change this later. You can use it in your CSS. You can do whatever you want. I'm setting it to whatever lighter color I'd done first in my JavaScript. And that's it. Properties and values. I'm like 2 down. This is great. Cool thing about types, they're animatable. There's only a few in CSS at the moment. Color is actually interoperable, so it's very easy for me now to make and animate like some keyframes using that type that I've just created and do like a nice little gradient fade on the button. A lot of the demos that you see using properties and values are essentially doing that. Cool. Break time. Break time. Workers and worklets. So people put this under the Houdini thing, but I'm just going to do a little aside for it because I think it's probably the other APIs. We've probably all heard about workers. We've probably started using them. This is great. I just want to touch on them and clarify what they are because we're going to talk a little bit more about what's going on. Workers in JavaScript mean running a script off of the main thread. You have your main script. You have a script that you register as a worker. You talk to it. You register it. You talk to it. You send messages back and forth. It is running off the main thread. That's a worker. A worklet, also running off the main thread, but it has a predefined class, which means you have predefined properties and methods that you can use. Again, it works in the same way. You register it. You talk to it. That's a worklet. right? It is like a worker. It's just like a little existing MIDI worker with cool stuff. Okay. CSS Paint API. Oh, hello. CSS Paint API? Yeah, okay. This allows us to register a Paint worklet, see what I did there, in our JavaScript for use wherever we might want to use an image in our CSS, right? So all of these APIs are, like I said, extending the functionality of CSS. So each one that we're going to see is going to be focused on a small part of CSS which we might want to add cool stuff to. So anywhere that you might use an image, so think about background images, border images, image masks, things like that. And the way that we use it in our CSS is we call the paint function. And what I'm referencing here is the worklet that I've registered, which I'll show you in a minute. We do have to register the worklet in our main script, which is the little bit at the bottom there, which is css.paintworklet.addModule. I'm referencing the worklet file which I've created, dots.js. You may have noticed all the way through the talk, these dots, they tend to move around. This is using CSS Paint. So all the backgrounds for all the slides, for the entirety of this talk, is using the CSS Paint API, and it's basically using this code. So I have created the worklet, I've registered it, and I'm referencing it on my slide, dot slide. My background image is dots. This is how it's moving around. Now, the easiest way for me to explain the worklet itself is to show you. Can't remember what number it is. Oh, it is 6, yes. And this is it. We have a register paint function. We call it whatever we want as long as it's what we're referring to in the paint function in our CSS. So I've got dots. Now, the CSS Paint API worklet harnesses the Canvas API. So if you haven't worked with the 2D context, well, actually, you can use 3D as well. What am I saying? If you haven't used the Canvas, the HTML5 Canvas API, you might want to look into it if you want to use this. I don't have time to sort of go over that. I wish I did. I love it. But that's what I'm doing in this script. You basically draw whatever you want as the image using Canvas code. And I'm doing that in here. So I have a function just down here which is drawing the dots. And as you can see, I'm doing like context, begin path, fill, context, like draw lots of dots. That's basically what this function is doing. In this register paint function, I have the name. Then we pass in the class, and this is the thing about worklets, is you pass in a very specific class for each kind of worklet that you have, and it gives you magic, right? Each one specific. The CSS Paint worklet gives you the context which you need, so the canvas context to draw, the size of the element that you are using, that you're calling the paint function on, so you get the height and the width, in this case for the slides. So I can use that. The dots have been changing position. So I am just saying, what are my constraints? My x and y values stay in those constraints because I have the width and the height. We get any custom properties that are affecting that element. So you can see here on line 7, I can get the input properties. I can return that main color. So that's how I can change the dot's color in reference to the sections of the talk. I'm like, OK, it's purple now, it's blue now, it's pink now, because I've got access to these custom properties, which can be types with typed.om. It's all links together. And then that's all this class is really doing, is this paint here. That's the key. And I'm like, I'm doing some maths on where I want the dots and how big I want the dots to be, because why not? It's JavaScript, and just do what I want. And here, I'm just calling the dots function, and it's drawing those dots for me. Okay. I feel like saying, like, any questions? That's quite a lot of you, so you know, I'm used to classes of 12. No, we're good. Those are the 3 that I wanted to talk about in detail. I'm just going to go over the next 2 very briefly, because I actually haven't, those 3 are the ones that I sort of went into when I was writing demos, and they were the most spec'd out at the time. These two I haven't written anything for yet, and when I was looking into them for the talk, I was like, I wanted to sit and write some demos. So there will be a version 2. I'll come back in a couple of years and we can go over these. The layout API works a lot like the CSS Paint API. You register a layout worklet, and it gives you access to layout features of that element and its child elements, right? So we've got a little bit, thank you, of this. So instead of using it wherever you use an image, you just use it on the display property in your CSS. You call the layout function, not the paint function, and that's where you reference your layout worklet. You register a layout worklet like we registered the paint worklet, and you reference the layout worklet. I don't have an example of this, but suffice to say, the access that you get in the class in that worklet is access to the constraints of the parent element, where it is, how big it is, any of the children element within that element, where they are, how big they are, all the stuff that you would need to create a custom layout. Think masonry, think hexagon tiling, think, I'm doing hexagon tiling, think all that kind of stuff, right? That's layout. Animation worklet, slightly different, slightly more confusing. Needs to do a little bit more work on this. Again, you do have to register the worklet, but this is about taking the animation timeline off of the main thread. So you actually need to do a little bit more work. You've got to specify the keyframes of the animation, and you get access to different kinds of timelines. At the moment, the only one I'm aware of is scroll. So you get a scroll timeline, and you can do things like parallax very nicely, very performantly, because it's not on the main thread. But you do have to specify what animation you want and when you want it to happen separately. Okay, all right. I'm feeling good. I'm feeling it's 11:40. That's my stop time. CSS Houdini, well done, class. I am here for questions, which we won't do now, but I am here for questions for the rest of the day, so please come and ask me. Also around for questions about audio, MIDI, and Canvas, as Bruce said. This will probably end up being a workshop at some point, I'm sure. Resources, check my Twitter. There is a scheduled tweet coming in about 20 minutes with a link to resources where you can find further reading. There's some amazing people writing about this and doing stuff around this. Sam Richards, Snugog on Twitter, he has done an amazing site, houdini.glitch.me, which goes through all of these APIs and has interactive examples for all of them. Follow Una, she's doing some amazing stuff just around the custom properties and colors. And like, oh, it's amazing. Surma gets a mention because Surma apparently has to be mentioned in every single talk. And bother Tab Atkins if you notice any problems with any of them, because it's Tab. Thank you very much. That's it. Yeah.